Canada's red-hot inflation rate cooled slightly for the second time in as many months, but it was higher than what economists had expected. The annual rate slowed to 6.9% in September, down from 7% in August. Food prices are still soaring at the fastest pace in decades, up more than 11% year over year. And a new survey suggests the rising cost of living will have Canadians tightening their purse strings this holiday season. Our Scott Peterson is here now to break it all down for us. So these latest numbers, Scott, what do you read into this?
We read into it that inflation remains stubbornly high. It came in higher than economists were expecting, and this is expected to have another wallop effect from the Bank of Canada as early as next week, and another rate hike, and the expected 6th consecutive rate hike from the Bank of Canada. But just to touch on those numbers again, Diane, because they are a little bit hotter than a lot of economists were expecting. 6.9% is our new annual interest rate, and that's down from over 8%, a record 40-year high that we saw just a few months ago back in June. So it is going in the right direction, but not as fast, certainly, as the Bank of Canada would like. When we take a look at the month as well, gasoline prices fell actually about 7.5%. You would think that would take more pressure off these rising prices, but not the case. Gasoline prices still, as a footnote, still up about 13% over this time last year, but certainly down from the dramatic highs that we saw earlier this year. But food is what everyone is focused on, because up until this time, they've been dramatically at 40-year highs. New 40-year highs now for food prices that continue to increase. 11.4% is the new inflation rate, and food prices year over year have not increased that quickly, that fast, going all the way back to 1981. So in the lifetimes of a lot of Canadians out there. Also, wages is another metric here as far as keeping track of how much this is hurting our pocketbooks. They're only up in the neighborhood of still a healthy 5.2%, but nowhere near to keep up with what the prices that we're seeing rising here. So what that means is these additional prices, anything above 5.2, is coming directly out of our pocketbooks. Now, if we bring the metric back and focus on the bigger picture here, let's take a look at where we are overall with the inflation rate. And this is really the graph the Bank of Canada is going to be looking at for their interest rate decision just next week. That red line there is when you include everything, but that blue line is when you exclude volatile items like gasoline, like food, and that's at 5.4%, and that's almost triple the comfort zone of the Bank of Canada at 2%. So the reaction out this morning is this certainly puts more pressure on the Bank of Canada to do a 6th consecutive interest rate hike. They've already hiked interest rates. The overnight rate anyways, 300 basis points. This potentially could take us to 4%. And a lot of economists say we're going to go to 4.25% for the overnight rate before things start to cool down. And of course, that overnight rate is the rate that banks and financial companies borrow at and lend to the rest of us. So lots of concern about rising food prices yet again this morning.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much, Scott. Now we want to stay on this story. We've reached Kevin Page in Ottawa. He's the former parliamentary budget officer. He's also president and CEO of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. So now, Kevin, we're hearing this news about the inflation rate, now 6.9%. What was your reaction when you heard this?
Well, I mean, 6.9%, as Scott alluded to, it's a very high number. It's well above, the target. I think, at 6.9% or hovering around 7%. I think if we compare ourselves with other countries, the United States, it's above 8%. The average in Europe is around 10%. So I mean, I think it's high inflation, and it's still work to do. I think by the Bank of Canada to bend this arc downwards.
Right. I mean, for viewers who haven't been maybe paying the closest attention, what is causing this unprecedented rise in inflation?
Yeah, a number of factors, Dan. I think, and some of it kind of goes back to, more than a year ago when we actually inflation. No one was talking about inflation in the summer of 2021. There's at that point in time we had enormous fiscal stimulus, fiscal supports. Enormous monetary policy accommodation, very low, interest rates, bank rates. So a lot of stimulus was being put in the economy. And then I think the economy recovered very quickly. We were dealing with supply constraints, that were related to COVID, then supply constraints related to, the Ukraine war. So a combination of factors. And more recently, like in the last few months, we're seeing like this food inflation. Certainly this month, the previous month, month-to-month increases north of 1%, each month on a seasonally adjusted basis. So for consumers going to, the grocery stores, it feels like double-digit inflation, with respect to food.
Right, yeah, and this is a huge issue, of course. You got to eat, got to maybe perhaps make a menu that's less expensive, I suppose. But I mean, when you look ahead, the food is still rising, even though we're talking about the overall rate coming down ever so slightly. When you look at the food portion of that, 11% increase. What do you see happening there?
Yeah, Dan, I think that the people that are studying food prices, that are looking carefully at the market, and just back to your point, you really can't hide from the food basket. These price increases that are in double-digit range, they're high for meats, they're high for grains, they're high for dairy products, even vegetables are up significantly. So it's not that you can just sort of adjust your budget to kind of to reduce food price inflation. But I think there is a sense that it's possible that these high prices that we're experiencing right now will peak, this year, and we'll see some relief as we, in later 2022 into 2023. People are looking at these food price contract future markets. There's some sense that there's some, the margins for farmers in some of these areas are pretty healthy in the grain industry. They can start increasing supply, and just a lot of hope that there's, more grain moving out of the Ukraine. And maybe some better weather events over the next year will help on top of it. So these are, you can't bank on it, but it's just there's a sense that maybe this is the worst it's going to be. It'll get a little bit better, but these prices are still very high.
But let's talk about interest rates. I mean, you heard Scott reporting that, of course, when inflation is so high, this puts pressure on the Bank of Canada to, again, use these whatever levers are available to it to try and chill things out in the economy. And they've been raising interest rates so high. Now, of course, people are saying this result means rates might go up again. I mean, how does that help, really?
Well, it certainly puts the economy and the outlook of the economy in a sort of a dangerous spot. It's you see central banks, not just in Canada, but obviously the United States, the Federal Reserve, the UK, across Europe, they're all increasing these bank rates at the same time. They're all worried about locking in these higher inflationary expectations. There's a sense that that your policy is working to actually slow down the the overall growth rate of the economy, reduce demand. So the concern is that a recession that not only decreases output, but actually really weakens the labor market. And it's one thing to deal with high food price inflation when you have an unemployment rate that's just around 5%. If we were to see a recession and unemployment rate rise to kind of 8%, perhaps in that range, it's just a lot harder to deal with this. So I think it's we want policymakers to actually deal with this high inflation, reduce inflationary expectations, but we want to make sure that we maintain as much as possible a strong labor market over the next year as we kind of deal with high inflation.
One last thing, do you have any suggestions for people who are struggling to make ends meet?
I think everybody's kind of looking at their budget. They're rebalancing things out there. It changes from budget to budget. Obviously, low-income people are just they're just getting overwhelmed by these higher food prices. A lot of their their more limited income is going to food, so they're really being hit the hardest. I think it's important that policymakers kind of continue to look at how they're being impacted, so we're helping vulnerable people in this time. I think everybody's adjusting. The people are looking. People that are on fixed mortgages, they're about to renew, are starting to look at their budgets. They may have 1 or 2 young children. How do they adjust? So I think these are conversations that are going to take place around the supper tables or breakfast tables, throughout the fall. Unfortunately, but again, as long as we have a strong labor market, I think we could ride through this. I think policymakers, governors of the Bank of Canada, finance ministers, got to be careful. We need a soft landing for this economy. We do not need a recession.
All right. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Kevin Page is a former parliamentary budget officer. We reached him in Ottawa.